The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the small room, bouncing off metal walls that had been my home for the last 6 years. I am Daniel Cole, Junior Liaison Officer for the Human Delegation to the Galactic Council, and in exactly 4 minutes, every single one of my people would be gone from this station forever. I did not move at first. I just stared at the countdown ticking on the screen above my desk. 3 minutes, 58 seconds. My hands were steady, but my heart was not. Around me, the last few human staff members moved with quiet purpose, closing crates, shutting down terminals, speaking to each other in low voices. No shouting, no panic, just calm, practiced movement, like a team that had rehearsed this moment 100 times, even though none of us ever truly believed it would happen. Through the wide window of the embassy lounge, I could see other delegates gathering. Tall, slender beings with silver skin pressed their faces close to the glass, watching us the way someone watches an animal pace inside a cage, curious but unconcerned. They did not understand. They thought this was just another empty gesture from a species they had grown tired of tolerating. 3 days ago, the council had voted. I remembered every second of that meeting because I had been sitting in the gallery, watching the screens flash with the final tally. 312 votes against humanity, 41 in favor. Our trade rights, stripped. Our seat at the table, removed. Our voice, silenced. All because a handful of powerful delegates decided we were too unpredictable, too young, too dangerous to be trusted with influence in their galaxy. I remembered the speaker's voice most of all, smooth and certain, echoing through the chamber. He had said humanity was a passing storm, loud and disruptive, but ultimately small. He said the galaxy did not need us. He said we should be grateful we were allowed to stay as long as we had. I had wanted to stand up and shout something back. I had wanted to remind him of every system we had stabilized, every crisis we had quietly solved, every late-night call our engineers had answered when nobody else could. But that was not my place. I was a junior officer. My job was to listen, record, and report. So I sat there, silent, and watched as the council congratulated itself for putting humanity in its place. What none of them understood, not even slightly, was that humanity does not argue when we are insulted. We simply leave. My supervisor, a sharp, quiet woman named Laura Bennett, walked past my desk with a final box of files balanced on her hip. She paused only long enough to glance at my screen. 2 minutes, Cole, she said. Get your bag. We are not staying 1 second past the deadline. Yes, ma'am, I said, and stood up so fast my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. I grabbed my single bag, already packed for 3 days, because we had known this moment was coming since the vote. There had been no announcement to the rest of the galaxy, no press release, no formal declaration of withdrawal, just quiet instructions passed down through secure channels. Pack your things. Finish your reports. Be ready to leave at the appointed hour. As I walked through the corridor toward the embassy's main hangar, I passed dozens of empty offices. 3 days ago, these rooms had been full of life, full of arguments over trade routes and translation errors and supply schedules. Now they were hollow shells, stripped bare, every personal item already shipped out over the past 72 hours in careful, unremarkable cargo runs that nobody outside our delegation had thought twice about. That was the part that struck me most as I walked. We had not left in a panic. We had left like professionals, methodically, quietly, without drama. While the council was busy celebrating its victory over the troublesome humans, our people had spent 3 days dismantling 6 years of presence with the precision of a surgical team. I reached the hangar and found Laura waiting beside the transport ship, her tablet glowing in the dim light. Around her, the last 12 members of our delegation gathered in a loose circle, checking each other's gear out of habit more than necessity. "Final head count!" Laura called out. Sound off. Names rang out one by one. Ethan Brooks, Grace Whitfield, Henry Lockwood, Claire Dawson, Nathan Cross, Sophie Lang, each voice steady, each face calm. When my name was called, I answered the same way, even though my stomach felt like it had folded itself into a knot. "All accounted for," Laura said, tapping her tablet. "Board the ship. We launch in 90 seconds. I climbed the ramp last, pausing for just a moment to look back at the station that had been my entire adult life. Through the hangar's open doorway, I could see the distant shapes of alien officials gathering at the observation windows, watching us leave with expressions I could only describe as mild curiosity, the kind you might give a parade passing through a town you do not particularly care about. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. The ramp closed behind me with a soft hiss, and I found a seat near the back of the cabin, strapping myself in, just as the ship's engines began their low, familiar hum. Across from me, Ethan Brooks caught my eye and gave me a small, tired smile. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said. 6 years, and it just ends like this. No fight, no speech, just packing up and walking out the door. "That's exactly the point," Laura said from the front of the cabin, not turning around. "We do not fight people who refuse to listen. We let them figure it out on their own." I thought about her words as the ship lifted off, the station's lights shrinking below us, until they were nothing more than a faint glow against the dark curve of the planet's atmosphere. I thought about all the systems we had quietly maintained, the relays we had calibrated, the supply routes we had untangled when nobody else could make sense of them. I thought about how casually the Council had dismissed every contribution, as if it had been a favor we owed them, rather than a service freely given. The ship cleared the station's defensive perimeter and angled toward open space. Through the small window beside my seat, I watched the embassy grow smaller and smaller, until it was just a single point of light among thousands of others. "Where do we go now?" I asked, mostly to fill the silence. "Home," Laura said simply. "Final orders. All personnel return to human space immediately. No further diplomatic contact authorized until further notice." "And after that?" She finally turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something other than calm professionalism in her expression. It was not anger. It was not satisfaction either. It was something closer to quiet certainty, the look of someone who already knew exactly how the next few days were going to unfold, and felt no need to rush toward it. "After that," she said, "we wait, and we watch what happens to a galaxy that just convinced itself it never needed us." I did not understand what she meant, not fully, not yet. I assumed she was talking about pride, about the bruised ego of a species that had been publicly humiliated, and was simply trying to find comfort in the idea that the Council would eventually regret its decision. I thought it was a small, human kind of hope, the sort of thing people say to make themselves feel better after losing something important. I was wrong. I would understand exactly how wrong within the next 48 hours. As our ship pushed deeper into open space, leaving the Council's territory behind, I noticed something through the cabin's rear display, a series of small status updates scrolling silently across a secondary screen, monitoring stations and relays scattered across a dozen systems we were leaving behind. I had seen these kinds of monitoring feeds before, but I had never paid close attention to them because they were not part of my normal duties. Now, watching them scroll past in the quiet of the cabin, I noticed something odd. Dozens of these stations were marked with a single tag I had never seen applied to so many locations at once. Human maintained. I sat up straighter, leaning toward the screen. "Laura," I said quietly, "what is this list?" She glanced over, then back at her own tablet, her expression unreadable. "That," she said, "is every piece of Council infrastructure that has been kept running, in whole or in part, by human engineers, human logistics teams, or human-designed systems over the past several years. There are hundreds of entries here. There are over 400, she said, and as of right now, every single one of them just lost its support staff." I looked at the screen again, scrolling slowly through the list. Communication relays, navigation beacons, supply chain coordination hubs, medical distribution networks, each one tagged with a small note indicating the percentage of critical function maintained by human personnel. Some were as low as 10%, others were as high as 90%. "They never knew," I said slowly, the realization settling over me like a heavy blanket. The Council never understood how much of their own galaxy depended on us. "No," Laura said, "they never asked. They assumed our presence was charity, a gift they were generously allowing us to give. They never imagined it was structural. They never imagined that pulling us out would feel like pulling a support beam out of a building they thought was made of solid stone." I sat back in my seat, my mind racing through the implications. 6 years of quiet, careful work, embedded so deeply into the daily function of council space that nobody outside our delegation had ever bothered to map its true scale. 6 years of fixing problems nobody else could solve, smoothing over gaps nobody else could see, holding together systems that everyone else assumed simply worked on their own. And now, all of it was gone, walked away in less than 72 hours, with no warning, no negotiation, and no apology. I thought about the speaker's voice in that final session, calm and certain, telling the chamber that humanity was small and disposable. I thought about the silver-skinned delegates watching us leave through the observation windows, their expressions filled with nothing but mild, dismissive curiosity. They had no idea what they had just done. I looked out the window one last time before the ship engaged its long-range engines, watching the Council's territory shrink into a distant smear of light behind us. Somewhere back there, in a few dozen systems scattered across a galaxy that had just declared itself better off without us, the first cracks were already beginning to form. Quiet at first, small, easy to miss. But I had seen that list. I had seen the numbers. And I understood, finally, exactly what Laura had meant when she said we would simply wait and watch. The Council had spent years insulting a species they never bothered to understand. They had voted us out of their chamber, stripped our rights, and dismissed our contributions as irrelevant. They had assumed silence meant weakness, and a quiet exit meant defeat. They were about to learn, in the most undeniable way possible, exactly how wrong they had been. As the ship's engines roared to life and the stars outside began to blur into long streaks of light, I closed my eyes and allowed myself one small, quiet thought. The same thought that I suspected every single person aboard that ship was thinking in that exact moment. Let them figure it out on their own. They were about to. The first sign of trouble reached us 18 hours after our ship crossed back into human territory, and it came in the form of a single, garbled message that nobody on the bridge could fully explain. I was sitting in the small communications bay near the rear of the ship, helping Sophie Lang sort through a backlog of administrative reports, when the alert chimed softly on her console. She frowned at the screen, tapping through a series of menus before turning to me with a puzzled expression. "Cole, come look at this," she said. "This is not addressed to us. It is not even encrypted for human channels. I think it is a leaked council relay message." I leaned over her shoulder and read the text, scrolling across the screen. It was written in the clipped, formal style the council used for emergency broadcasts, the kind of message meant to be read by officials, not soldiers, full of careful, bureaucratic language, even in the middle of a crisis. Relay Station 742, reporting critical signal degradation. Navigation corridor through the Vesson debris field no longer receiving accurate positional data. Requesting immediate technical support from assigned maintenance contractor. Below that line was a second message, sent 4 hours later, in a noticeably more urgent tone. Maintenance contractor unreachable. Repeated attempts to establish contact have failed. Requesting alternative technical support from Council Engineering Division. And below that, a third message, sent only 20 minutes before we intercepted the signal. No response from Council Engineering Division. Backup systems failing. 3 cargo vessels currently transiting corridor without accurate guidance, requesting any available assistance. I read the messages twice, then a third time, before I understood what I was looking at. The Vesson debris field was one of the most dangerous navigation hazards in that entire sector of Council space. A chaotic scattering of broken asteroids and old wreckage left over from some ancient conflict nobody remembered the details of anymore. Ships could only cross it safely by following narrow, carefully mapped corridors. Corridors that required constant recalibration because the debris shifted slightly with every passing gravitational tide. I knew exactly who had been responsible for maintaining those corridors, because I had processed the maintenance contracts myself during my second year as a junior officer. A small team of 6 human engineers, led by a quiet, methodical man named Edward Voss, had spent the better part of 3 years building and refining the navigation system that kept that corridor safe. They had done it not because the Council paid generously for the work, but because Edward had once told me he simply liked solving problems nobody else could solve. Edward Voss had been on our ship for the last 18 hours, sitting 2 rows behind me, sleeping with his head against the window. "They have no idea their navigation system is gone," I said quietly. "They thought it just worked. They never realized someone had to keep adjusting it every single day. Sophie's frown deepened as she scrolled further down the message log. "There's more," she said. "This is not the only relay reporting problems." She pulled up a wider view, a map of the sector dotted with small markers, indicating systems experiencing technical failures. I counted 12 markers at first glance, then watched as a 13th appeared while I was still counting, blinking into existence somewhere near the edge of Council territory. "This is happening everywhere at once," I said. "Not everywhere," Sophie corrected gently. "Just everywhere we used to be." I sat back in my chair, staring at the growing map, and felt a strange mixture of vindication and unease settle in my chest. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied, to feel that the Council was finally getting exactly what it deserved, for years of casual dismissal and quiet disrespect. But another part of me, the part that remembered the faces of alien crew members I had worked alongside for years, people who had never personally insulted us, people who had simply been caught inside a system controlled by leaders who did not listen, felt something closer to worry. I thought about Captain Owen Hale, the quiet, steady commander of our transport ship, a man who had served on Council assignments long before I had even joined the delegation. I made my way to the bridge, message log in hand, and found him standing at the main console, already reviewing a similar stream of reports. "You've seen it too," I said. He nodded without looking up. "I have contacts on 3 different Council supply vessels," he said. "2 of them have already gone dark. Not destroyed, as far as I can tell, just lost, drifting somewhere they should not be, because their navigation data stopped updating correctly." "Lost," I repeated. "Not in immediate danger?" "Not yet," Owen said. "But lost in a debris field is rarely a permanent condition. It tends to become dangerous eventually, especially if nobody comes looking for them." I thought about the families of those crew members, wherever they were, completely unaware that the careful, invisible work keeping their loved ones safe had simply stopped existing overnight. I thought about how easily this entire situation could have been avoided if the Council had simply treated humanity as a partner worth respecting instead of a problem worth dismissing. "What happens now?" I asked. Owen finally looked up from his console, his expression calm but serious. "Now we follow our orders," he said. "No further diplomatic contact authorized until further notice. We are not going back to fix this for them, Cole. Not unless we are formally asked, through proper channels, with proper respect." "And if they don't ask?" "Then they figure it out themselves," he said. "Just like Laura told you." I returned to my seat near the rear of the ship, but I could not stop watching the message log scroll past on Sophie's console. Over the following hours, the pattern repeated itself across dozens of different systems, each report following a similar arc. A small technical problem appears. A request for support goes out. The original support, quietly human, no longer exists. A second request goes to Council Engineering. Council Engineering, stretched thin and unfamiliar with systems they never personally built, struggles to respond in time. The problem grows. I learned later that the Council's engineering division had never been designed to handle the kind of detailed, hands-on maintenance work that human contractors had quietly absorbed over the years. Council engineers were trained in broad theoretical systems, grand architectural designs, meant to impress other delegates during official inspections. They were not trained in the tedious, unglamorous work of recalibrating navigation beacons every few days, or patching small communication errors before they became large ones. That kind of work had always been considered beneath their attention, the sort of task better suited to contractors from less prestigious species. Humanity had never minded doing it. We had never demanded recognition for it either. We had simply done the work, quietly and consistently, year after year, while the Council congratulated itself on the smooth, efficient operation of its vast territories. Nobody had ever stopped to ask why everything ran so smoothly. They had simply assumed it always would. By the time our ship crossed the final boundary into confirmed human space, the markers on Sophie's map had multiplied into the dozens, then spread further still, touching systems I had not even realized depended on human support. A medical distribution network in a distant agricultural colony, suddenly struggling to coordinate shipments after losing the small human logistics team that had quietly streamlined its operations for the past 2 years. A translation network used by Council diplomats during sensitive negotiations, suddenly producing strange, Garbled errors after the human linguists who had calibrated its core algorithms simply stopped maintaining it. Each failure on its own seemed small, almost forgettable. But together, they painted a picture that I suspected very few people inside the council had ever truly understood until this exact moment. Humanity had not been a guest in their galaxy, tolerated out of politeness. We had been quietly holding pieces of it together, filling gaps nobody else had noticed, solving problems nobody else had wanted to solve. And now, all at once, every single one of those gaps was reopening. I found Laura in the ship's small galley later that evening, sitting alone with a cup of something warm cradled in her hands, watching the same growing map on a portable screen propped against the table. "You knew this would happen," I said, sitting down across from her. "Not just guessed. Knew." She nodded slowly. "We have been tracking our own footprint in council space for years, Cole. Quietly, carefully. Every contract, every informal favor, every small fix, nobody else noticed. It was never a secret exactly, but it was never something we advertised either. We simply did the work." "Why?" I asked. "If you knew how dependent they had become on us, why not use that as leverage? Why not demand better treatment, a stronger voice, more respect at the table?" Laura set her cup down and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something thoughtful and a little tired. "Because that is not who we wanted to be," she said. "We did not want to hold a galaxy hostage to prove a point. We simply wanted to be treated fairly, as equals, contributing members of a larger community. We offered our skills freely because we believed cooperation made everyone stronger, including us. And instead, they voted us out," I said quietly. "And instead, they voted us out," she agreed. "So now we leave, exactly as we said we would, and we let the consequences of that decision speak for themselves. We are not doing this to them, Cole. They are doing this to themselves. We are simply no longer standing in the way of it." I thought about that distinction for a long time after our conversation ended, lying awake in my narrow bunk while the ship carried us steadily homeward. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a crisis unfold from a distance, knowing exactly why it was happening, knowing exactly who could fix it, and choosing instead to simply let it run its course. It did not feel like victory. It felt like watching a slow, inevitable collapse that nobody in power had been wise enough to prevent. By the time I finally drifted off to sleep, the markers on Sophie's map had grown to cover nearly every major system in council space, each one a small, quiet reminder of exactly how much humanity had been carrying, without anyone ever bothering to notice. Somewhere out there, in chambers full of officials who had spent years dismissing us as small and unimportant, the first true wave of concern was only just beginning to take hold. We had left quietly. We had asked for nothing in return. And now, for the very first time, the council was about to discover exactly how much they had taken for granted. I woke the next morning to the soft chime of the ship's intercom, calling all senior staff to a briefing in the main cabin. I was not technically senior staff, but Laura had asked me to join anyway, since I had spent the most time studying the dependency reports during the journey. The cabin was crowded when I arrived, every seat filled with familiar faces, all of them looking tired in the particular way that comes from staring at bad news for too many hours without sleep. Captain Owen Hale stood at the front of the room, a large display behind him showing a sector map covered almost entirely in small warning markers. "I will keep this brief," he said. "As most of you already know, multiple systems across former Council operating space are experiencing cascading technical failures. What started as isolated incidents has now spread into something closer to a coordinated collapse. Though I want to be clear, nobody coordinated this. It is simply the natural result of removing a structural support all at once." "Any word from the council leadership?" Grace Whitfield asked from her seat near the front. "Nothing official," Owen said. "Our monitoring stations have picked up internal communications, suggesting an emergency session has been called, but no formal contact has been made with human authorities. As far as the council is concerned, we no longer exist as a diplomatic presence in their space." "Do we have any obligation to respond if they do reach out?" Henry Lockwood asked. "That decision sits well above my position," Owen said. "For now, our orders remain unchanged. No contact, no assistance. We continue our return to human territory and await further instructions." I raised my hand. and Owen nodded for me to speak. What about the ships that are stranded? I asked. The ones lost in the debris fields, the ones without working navigation. Are we just leaving them out there? The room went quiet for a moment. Owen's expression remained calm, but I could see the weight behind his next words before he even said them. We did not put them there, Cole, he said. We built systems that kept them safe for years, free of charge, and we maintained those systems faithfully until the moment we were told our presence was no longer wanted. The Council made a choice. Those crews are not in danger because of anything we did. They are in danger because the people who removed us never considered what removing us would actually mean. I did not have a response to that. I understood the logic, even agreed with it on some level, but it still left a heavy, uncomfortable feeling in my chest that I could not quite shake. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering logistics for our return journey and contingency plans in case the Council attempted any last-minute diplomatic outreach during our transit. I listened carefully, but my mind kept drifting back to that growing map of warning markers, each one representing real people, real crews, real lives, caught in the middle of a political decision they likely had no part in making. After the briefing ended, I found myself standing near the cabin's rear window, watching the stars blur past as the ship maintained its steady course homeward. Sophie joined me a few minutes later, her tablet still showing the same map, now updated with even more markers than before. It is strange, she said quietly. I always thought if this day ever came I would feel proud, vindicated. Instead, I mostly just feel tired. Same, I admitted. I keep thinking about all the people we worked with, not the ones who voted against us, the ordinary crews, the engineers, the translators. They didn't insult us, they just got caught in the middle of it. Sophie nodded slowly. Maybe that is the real lesson here, she said. Not that humanity is powerful, or that the Council was foolish. Maybe the lesson is that decisions made by a few powerful people at the top of a system always end up falling hardest on the people who had no say in making them. I thought about her words for a long time after that conversation, watching the stars streak past the window as our ship carried us further and further from a galaxy that had just discovered, far too late, exactly how much it had relied on a species it never bothered to understand. Somewhere behind us, the warning markers continued to multiply, spreading silently across the dark, marking the slow unraveling of a system built on assumptions nobody had ever bothered to question. We were almost home, but the story, I was beginning to understand, was only just beginning. 3 days after we crossed back into human territory, I was reassigned to a small monitoring office on the outer edge of our home system, a quiet posting meant to track communications drifting in from former Council space. It was not glamorous work, mostly long hours of listening to garbled transmissions and filing reports nobody seemed in a hurry to read. But it placed me closer to the unfolding crisis than almost anyone else in our delegation, and within a week, I understood why Laura had recommended me for the position. The Council, it turned out, talked a great deal when it believed nobody outside its own chambers was listening. I shared the office with a quiet, sharp-eyed analyst named Claire Dawson, who had spent years specializing in alien communication patterns long before the withdrawal began. On my 3rd day in the post, she waved me over to her console without looking up from the screen. "You need to hear this," she said. "It is an internal Council recording. Emergency session. Restricted access. But our older relay equipment is still technically registered in their system. Nobody has bothered to remove it yet." She played the recording, and the chamber's familiar acoustics filled the small room, that same cold, formal echo I remembered from the day of our final vote. The speaker's voice came through first, though it sounded noticeably different from the confident, dismissive tone I remembered. There was an edge to it now, something tighter and more controlled. "Order," he said. "I understand emotions are running high, but shouting over one another will not solve the problems currently affecting 43 separate systems." A new voice cut in immediately, sharp and frustrated, identifying itself through the recording's automatic translation system as Delegate Threx of the Vasan Trade Collective. 43, Threx repeated. 3 days ago it was 12. At this rate, by the end of the week, it will be every system that ever had a human contractor working within its borders. How did none of us know how deep their presence ran? Because we never asked, another voice answered, calmer, more measured. The system identified this speaker as Counselor Vale, a delegate I vaguely remembered from quieter committee meetings, someone who had rarely spoken during the larger sessions, but had always struck me as more thoughtful than most of her colleagues. We assumed our systems functioned on their own merit. We never considered how much of that function relied on quiet, unglamorous labor we were too proud to formally acknowledge. "This is not the time for blame," the speaker said sharply. "We need solutions, not reflection." "With respect," Vale replied, her tone steady despite the tension in the room. "Without reflection, we will not find solutions. We spent years treating human contributions as background noise, easily replaceable, hardly worth formal recognition. We were wrong. The numbers prove it." Claire paused the recording for a moment, glancing at me. "It gets more interesting," she said, before pressing play again. The speaker's voice returned, tighter now, clearly working to maintain control of a room that was rapidly slipping away from him. "Our engineering division is already working to address the most critical failures," he said. "Reassignments are underway. We will recalibrate the affected systems using our own resources." "Your own resources have already failed twice in the Vesson corridor," Threx snapped. 2 cargo vessels remain unaccounted for. A third reported critical hull stress 11 hours ago, after drifting into uncharted debris. How many more failures before we admit our engineering division was never equipped to handle this scale of maintenance? A long silence followed, heavy enough that I could almost feel it through the recording itself. "What exactly are you suggesting?" the speaker finally asked. "I am suggesting," Threx said, "that we formally request the return of human technical support, through proper diplomatic channels, with an appropriate apology for the manner in which they were dismissed." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, some in agreement, many sharply opposed. Claire let the recording play through nearly a full minute of chaotic, overlapping argument before the speaker finally managed to restore order. "We will not grovel before a species we voted to remove 3 days ago," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "That would set a dangerous precedent. It would suggest the Council's authority can be challenged simply by walking away from the table." "Their authority was never in question," Vale said quietly. "Only their willingness to continue supporting us without proper recognition. We mistook quiet generosity for permanent obligation. That mistake is now costing us dearly." I looked over at Claire, who paused the recording again, this time letting it sit in silence for a long moment. "There are 5 more recordings like this," she said. "Different sessions, different arguments, but the same basic shape. Some delegates want to reach out immediately and repair the relationship. Others, especially the more powerful and established member species, refuse to even consider it. They see it as a matter of pride." "Pride," I repeated, shaking my head. "People are stranded in debris fields, and they are arguing about pride." "It gets worse," Claire said. "Listen to this one." She pulled up a different recording, this one shorter, more clipped, clearly recorded during a smaller, more private meeting, rather than the full chamber session. Only 2 voices were present, both unfamiliar to me, identified only by generic council titles, rather than personal names. "The medical network in the Halvoran colony has gone completely dark," the first voice said. "Distribution schedules are in chaos. Without accurate coordination, critical supplies are reaching some outposts in excess, while others receive nothing at all." "How long until the situation becomes life-threatening?" the second voice asked. "Our projections suggest within the week, if the network is not restored," the first voice answered. "The human logistics team that maintained that network for the past 2 years left without a formal handover. Nobody else fully understands the underlying coordination algorithm. Can it not simply be rebuilt? In time, yes. Likely several months, possibly longer. We do not currently have anyone with the necessary expertise to shorten that timeline." A pause, then the second voice again, quieter this time. "Then people may suffer because of a vote taken in anger." "Yes," the first voice said simply. "That appears to be an accurate assessment." Claire stopped the recording and turned to face me fully. "This is not isolated anger anymore, Cole," she said. "This is becoming a genuine crisis, and the Council is fractured right down the middle on how to respond. Half of them want to swallow their pride and ask for help. The other half would rather watch their own systems fail than admit they made a mistake." I sat back in my chair, absorbing everything I had just heard. I thought about the families in the Halvoran colony. completely unaware that their medical supplies were at risk because of a political decision made in a chamber none of them had ever set foot in. I thought about the stranded crews drifting somewhere in the Vesson debris field, hoping for rescue that might never come if pride continued to outweigh practicality among the people who had the power to send it. What happens if they never ask for help? I asked. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. Then the consequences continue to spread, she said, slowly at first, then faster, as more systems begin to fail in ways nobody anticipated. Eventually, either enough delegates find the courage to overrule the proud ones, or the damage becomes severe enough that ordinary citizens within council space start demanding answers from their own governments. And if that happens, then the council's authority itself becomes the real casualty, she said. Not because of anything we did, but because of how they chose to handle what we left behind. I spent the rest of that day reviewing additional recordings and reports, watching the situation continue to unfold across dozens of different systems. A communication relay near the edge of council space lost connection entirely for nearly 6 hours, leaving an entire cluster of outposts isolated and unable to coordinate emergency services. A trade route that had once been considered one of the safest and most efficient in the sector experienced its first major cargo loss in over a decade, after navigational data drifted just enough to send a transport vessel directly into a previously charted hazard. Each incident on its own might have been dismissed as bad luck, a rare and unfortunate accident in an otherwise well-functioning system, but together, spread across so many different locations within such a short period of time, the pattern became impossible to ignore, even for those who desperately wanted to. That evening, Laura called a small group of us together for an informal briefing in the station's common area, away from the more rigid structure of official meetings. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying knowledge most people around her did not yet fully understand. "I want to be honest with all of you about something," she said, once everyone had settled into their seats. "What is happening right now in council space was never our goal. We did not leave hoping to cause harm. We left because we were told, clearly and repeatedly, that our presence was not wanted, that our contributions were unnecessary, that we were a problem rather than a partner. But people are suffering because of it," Henry Lockwood said quietly. "Innocent people who never voted against us." "Yes," Laura said, "and that is the part of this situation that none of us should ever feel good about, no matter how satisfying it might be to imagine the council finally facing consequences for their arrogance. We are not celebrating this. We are watching it happen because we have no authority to intervene without an official request, and because intervening without one would set a precedent that could be just as damaging as the situation we are currently witnessing. So we just wait," Grace Whitfield said. "We wait," Laura confirmed, "and we hope that enough voices within the council find the courage to do what is right before the damage becomes permanent." I thought about Councillor Vale's voice in that recording, calm and reasonable amid the chaos of her colleagues, urging reflection instead of stubborn pride. I wondered how many more delegates like her existed within that chamber, quietly aware of the mistake their species had made, but unable to overcome the louder, more powerful voices still clinging to wounded pride. Over the following days, the situation continued to deteriorate. Claire and I tracked the spread of failures with growing concern, watching as the markers on our map multiplied past 50, then 60, each new entry representing another system, caught in the widening consequences of a decision made without proper thought. The stranded cargo vessels in the Vesson debris field were eventually located, though not without significant damage to 2 of the 3 ships, and not without several tense days during which their fate remained genuinely uncertain. The Halvoran medical network, by contrast, continued to struggle, its distribution schedules remaining chaotic and unreliable, even as council engineers worked desperately to understand a system they had never needed to fully comprehend before. Through it all, the council's internal debate raged on, fractured and bitter, split between those who recognized the necessity of reaching out to repair what had been broken, and those who viewed any such gesture as an unacceptable admission of weakness. It was during this tense, uncertain period that the first formal communication finally arrived, addressed not to the broader human government, but specifically to our delegation's former embassy contact information, an address that technically no longer existed, but had clearly been retained somewhere within council records. I was the one who first noticed the incoming transmission, flagged by an automated system designed to catch any communication attempts using our old diplomatic credentials. I called Claire over immediately, and together, we watched as the message slowly decoded on the screen in front of us. It was short, formal, and carefully worded, clearly the product of intense internal negotiation before it had ever been sent. It requested, in careful, measured language, a private dialogue between council leadership and human authorities to discuss what it described only as matters of mutual concern. There was no apology in the message, no acknowledgement of the vote that had started everything, just a careful, guarded request for conversation, sent by a council still too proud to admit fault, but finally desperate enough to ask for help anyway. Claire looked at me, her expression caught somewhere between relief and frustration. "They still will not say it," she said. "Not directly, but this is them asking, Cole. In their own careful, indirect way, this is the council finally asking." I stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about everything that had led to this single, hesitant request. The arrogant dismissal in that final session, the quiet, dignified withdrawal that followed, the slow, cascading collapse of systems nobody had realized depended so heavily on us, the fractured, bitter debate within the council's own chambers between pride and necessity. And now, finally, this. A small, careful crack in that pride, just wide enough to let a single request slip through. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Laura said, appearing behind us with the same calm, steady expression she had carried since the moment we first left the embassy. "We decide exactly how humanity responds to a request from people who never expected to need us, sent by leaders who still cannot bring themselves to say they were wrong." I looked back at the message glowing softly on the screen, and felt the weight of the moment settle over the room. The galaxy's nightmare had only just begun to take shape, and now, for the very first time since our quiet departure, humanity held the next move entirely in its own hands. I did not expect to be chosen for the response mission, but 3 days after the council's careful, indirect request arrived, Laura called me into her office and told me to pack a single bag again, this time for a journey back into the very space we had so recently abandoned. "Why me?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "I am a junior officer. Surely there are more senior people better suited for this." "You read every dependency report," Laura said. "You listen to every recording from that chamber. You understand exactly what is at stake here, both the technical reality and the human cost of getting this wrong. That matters more right now than seniority." I did not argue further. Within hours, I found myself standing in a small departure bay, looking up at a ship unlike anything I had seen during my years working alongside council vessels. It was sleek, dark, and quiet, built with none of the ornamental flourishes the council favored on their official vessels. There were no elaborate markings, no decorative lighting, nothing meant to impress or intimidate. It simply looked efficient, purposeful, and absolutely certain of what it was. A tall, calm woman approached me as I stood staring up at the ship, her uniform marked with the insignia of a senior fleet officer. She introduced herself simply as Commander Meera Patel, the officer responsible for overseeing this particular mission. "You are Daniel Cole," she said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. "Laura tells me you understand the technical situation better than anyone else available on short notice." "I do my best," I said. "Good," she said, "because this mission is not about negotiation. It is about presence. We are not going to argue with the council. We are not going to apologize for leaving, and we are not going to grovel for their forgiveness. We are simply going to make ourselves visible, hear their formal request directly, and decide together what humanity's response will be." I followed her up the ramp, and within the hour, the ship lifted off, engines humming with a low, steady power that felt entirely different from the transport vessel I had traveled on just days before. This ship moved with a kind of quiet confidence that I found both reassuring and slightly unsettling, the same feeling I imagined the council itself must have experienced when this single vessel eventually appeared in their territory. The journey back into former council space took just under 2 days, and I spent most of it reviewing updated reports with Meera and a small team of technical advisors, mapping out exactly which failures remained unresolved and which systems had managed to stabilize on their own through sheer council effort. The picture remained troubling. The Halvoran medical network was still struggling, its distribution schedules a patchwork of partial fixes that left several outposts dangerously undersupplied. 2 communication relays near the outer edge of council space remained completely offline, isolating a small cluster of mining colonies from any meaningful contact with the rest of their territory. "They are stabilizing the visible problems," one of the technical advisors, a sharp young analyst named Lily Marsh, explained during one of our briefings. "But the underlying structural issues remain. Without proper long-term maintenance, these fixes will not hold. We are likely looking at repeated failures over the coming months, even if the immediate crisis appears to ease." "Will they understand that?" I asked. "Some will," Mira said. "Others will assume the worst has passed and grow complacent again. That is precisely why this conversation needs to happen directly, in person, rather than through carefully worded messages that allow both sides to avoid uncomfortable truths." As our ship approached the outer boundary of council space, I felt a familiar tightness return to my chest, the same nervous anticipation I had felt during our final departure days earlier. Through the forward display, I watched as distant council patrol vessels began adjusting their positions, clearly aware of our approach long before we crossed into clearly monitored territory.
"They see us,"
Lily said quietly, watching her own monitoring screen. "Let them," Mira said calmly. "We are not hiding." We continued our approach without deviation, our single ship moving steadily through space that had, until recently, been thick with official human diplomatic traffic. Now, as far as I could tell, we were the only human vessel anywhere in the entire sector, a single ship moving calmly through territory that had spent years insisting it did not need us. The reaction, when it came, was immediate and unmistakable. Council communication channels lit up with frantic activity the moment our ship crossed into clearly monitored space. Lily monitored the chatter closely, translating key fragments as they came through. "Multiple patrol vessels requesting identification," she reported. "Now requesting clarification on intent. Now requesting immediate response. Send the standard message," Mira said calmly. "Exactly as planned. Nothing more, nothing less." I watched as Lily transmitted a short, carefully worded broadcast, the same message we had spent hours refining during the journey. It was calm, direct, and entirely free of either apology or aggression, simply stating our identity, our destination, and our intention to discuss the Council's formal request through proper diplomatic dialogue. The response from Council channels grew even more frantic in the minutes that followed. Patrol vessels began repositioning rapidly, clearly uncertain how to interpret a single human ship approaching their most heavily defended territory without any visible military escort. Defensive systems activated across several nearby stations, though none of them made any aggressive move toward us, seemingly paralyzed by uncertainty rather than driven by clear strategy. "They do not know what to make of us," I said, watching the chaotic pattern of their movements on the display. "They expected either an apology or an attack," Mira said. "We are offering neither. That uncertainty is exactly the point." As we approached the heavily fortified regions surrounding the Council's primary administrative homeworld, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me fully. This was the same system where I had spent 6 years of my life working as a junior diplomat, the same chamber where I had watched our final humiliating vote unfold just days earlier. Now I was returning, not as a dismissed and powerless representative, but aboard a vessel that the entire Council clearly did not know how to handle. Our ship slowed as we approached the final approach corridor leading toward the homeworld's primary orbital station, the very station I had departed from less than 2 weeks earlier. Through the forward display, I could see a small fleet of Council vessels gathered near the station, their formation tight and clearly defensive, though still notably hesitant. A new transmission came through, this one formal and clearly originating from Council leadership rather than a confused patrol officer. Lily translated it quickly, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "They are requesting we hold position outside the station's immediate perimeter," she said. "They wish to confirm our intentions before granting docking clearance." "Reasonable," Mira said. "Hold position, send confirmation that we are awaiting their formal delegation, exactly as their own request specified." We held steady, engines idling quietly, while the Council fleet continued its nervous, uncertain formation nearby. I watched through the forward display as smaller shuttlecraft began moving between the station and several larger vessels, clearly carrying officials scrambling to coordinate an appropriate response to a situation none of them had fully anticipated. After nearly an hour of tense waiting, a single shuttle finally broke away from the formation and began approaching our ship directly. Lily confirmed its identification a moment later. "That is Counselor Vale's personal transport," she said, glancing at me with clear surprise. "She is coming herself." I felt a small, unexpected flicker of hope at that news. Out of everyone within that chamber, Vale had been the one voice during the emergency sessions that had urged reflection over pride, honesty over stubbornness. If she was the one chosen to lead this delegation, perhaps there was a genuine chance for this conversation to begin on solid footing. The shuttle docked with careful precision, and within minutes, Counselor Vale stepped aboard our ship, accompanied by only 2 aides, far fewer than the large, ceremonial delegations the Council typically favored during official visits. She looked tired, her usually composed expression carrying visible strain, though she carried herself with the same quiet dignity I remembered from her voice in those recorded sessions. Mira greeted her formally, and the two exchanged careful, measured pleasantries before Vale's gaze shifted toward me, recognition flickering across her face. "You were part of the original delegation," she said. "I remember you from the gallery, during the final vote." "I was," I confirmed. "Daniel Cole, I am sorry," she said quietly, and the simplicity of those 2 words carried more weight than any of the careful, formal language in the Council's original request. Not just for the vote itself, though that was a grave mistake. I am sorry for how long it took many of us to admit that mistake, clearly enough to act on it. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Mira finally broke the silence, her tone calm but firm. "We appreciate your honesty, Counselor," she said. "But this conversation needs to happen with the full Council, not in private shuttle meetings. Humanity left because we were dismissed publicly, in full session, by leaders unwilling to recognize what we contributed. If this relationship is going to be repaired, that repair needs to begin just as publicly, with the same chamber that voted us out now willing to face the consequences of that decision directly." Vale nodded slowly, her expression grim but resolute. "I expected you would say as much," she said. "I have already secured agreement for an emergency session, open to full chamber attendance, scheduled within the next several hours. Whether every delegate attends with the same willingness to reflect that I have found within myself remains to be seen. That is all we ask," Mira said. "A genuine opportunity for honest conversation, conducted openly, without hidden agendas or careful evasions." Vale agreed, and within the hour, our ship received formal clearance to dock directly at the station. The very same station I had departed from in quiet, dignified silence, less than 2 weeks earlier. As we approached the docking bay, I found myself standing beside Mira at the forward viewport, watching the familiar shape of the station grow larger in our view. "Nervous?" she asked, glancing at me. "A little," I admitted. "Last time I left this station, I genuinely did not know if I would ever return. Now here we are, and somehow it feels even more uncertain than before. That is because last time, the outcome was already decided," Mira said. "This time, what happens next is still entirely undetermined. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is also the only real opportunity either side has to choose something better than what came before." I thought about her words as our ship settled gently into its docking position, the same quiet, steady engines that had carried us through the Council's nervous, uncertain fleet, now bringing us safely back to the very place where this entire situation had first begun. Through the viewport, I could see a gathering crowd of Council officials and curious onlookers assembling near the docking bay, their expressions a complicated mixture of anxiety, curiosity, and something that looked almost like cautious hope. Whatever happened next, in that chamber, in front of that full assembly, would determine far more than just the fate of a few damaged relays or stranded cargo ships. It would determine whether the galaxy's nightmare, born from a single careless vote, could still be turned into something better, or whether the damage already done had grown too deep to ever fully repair. I took a steadying breath as the docking clamps engaged with a soft, final clunk, and followed Mira toward the exit ramp, ready to walk back into the very chamber that had once dismissed us so completely. this time as something the council had never truly expected to face again. The chamber looked exactly as I remembered it, vast and circular, rows of seats rising in tiers around a central speaking floor, every surface polished to a gleam that always struck me as more concerned with appearance than substance. The last time I had stood in this room, I had been a silent observer in the gallery, watching our fate decided by people who barely acknowledged my presence. This time, as Mira and I walked across the central floor with Councillor Vale beside us, every single seat in the chamber was filled, and every single eye was fixed directly on us. The silence felt different from the silence of our departure. That had been the quiet of dismissal, of people who believed they had already won and no longer needed to pay attention. This silence carried tension, uncertainty, and in more than a few faces scattered throughout the tiers, something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. The speaker stood at his usual position near the center of the floor, his expression carefully composed, though I could see the same tightness in his posture that I had heard in his voice during Claire's recordings. He waited until we reached the center of the room before speaking, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's familiar acoustics. "Commander Patel," he said, addressing Mira directly. "Representative Cole, the Council thanks you for accepting our invitation to dialogue." "We did not come for thanks," Mira said, her voice calm, but carrying easily through the silent chamber. "We came because your request reached us through proper channels, and because the situation affecting your territories has grown serious enough to demand a direct conversation, conducted openly, in front of the same chamber that created it." A murmur rippled through the tiers at her words, though the speaker raised a hand, and the room quieted again. "Very well," he said. "Let us proceed directly to the matter at hand. As you are certainly aware, the withdrawal of human technical support has resulted in significant operational difficulties across numerous systems within our territory." "Significant difficulties," Mira repeated, her tone carrying just enough edge to make the understatement clear without becoming openly confrontational. 2 cargo vessels suffered serious damage, drifting through an unmarked debris field. A medical distribution network serving an entire colony nearly collapsed entirely. Multiple communication relays went dark, isolating mining colonies from any meaningful contact with the rest of your territory. I would describe that as considerably more than a difficulty, speaker. The speaker's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not immediately respond. It was Councillor Vale who finally broke the silence, stepping forward to stand beside Mira and me on the central floor. "She is correct," Vale said, addressing the full chamber rather than simply the speaker. "And I believe it is time this body finally acknowledges that fact openly, rather than continuing to hide behind careful language designed to minimize our own failures." A wave of muttering spread through the tiers, some delegates nodding in clear agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Threx, the sharp-voiced delegate I remembered from Claire's recordings, rose from his seat near the front of the chamber. "I have said as much since the very first emergency session," he said. "We made a grave error in judgment. We dismissed a species whose quiet contributions had become structurally essential to the smooth function of our territories, and we did so out of nothing more than wounded pride and misplaced arrogance." "That is a generous interpretation of events," another delegate called out from higher in the tiers, his tone sharp and defensive. "We voted to remove a species that had grown increasingly unpredictable, increasingly difficult to control within established council structures. That decision was not made out of pride. It was made out of legitimate concern for stability." "Stability," Mira repeated, turning to address that delegate directly. "You removed the very species responsible for maintaining your stability, and the result was immediate, widespread instability across dozens of systems. If your concern was genuinely stability, perhaps you should have considered the actual structural role we played before voting to eliminate our presence entirely." The delegate had no immediate response, and the chamber fell into another tense, uncomfortable silence. I had not expected to speak during this session, content to remain a quiet presence beside Mira, but something about the weight of that silence pushed me forward, a sudden, unexpected urge to add something to this conversation that felt important enough to risk speaking out of turn. "May I say something?" I asked, glancing toward Mira first. She gave a small, approving nod, and I turned to face the full chamber, my heart pounding despite the calm I tried to project in my voice. 6 years ago, I arrived in this chamber as a junior officer, barely out of training, terrified of saying the wrong thing in front of people far more powerful than myself. I began. Over those 6 years, I watched human engineers, logistics teams, and translators work quietly, tirelessly, often without recognition, simply because we believed cooperation made everyone stronger. We never demanded gratitude. We never threatened to withhold our help as leverage. We simply did the work, because we believed it mattered. I paused, scanning the tiers of silent faces watching me. When this chamber voted to dismiss us, the message we received was clear. Our contributions were considered unnecessary. Our presence was considered a burden rather than a benefit. We left exactly as you asked us to, quietly, without protest, without retaliation. What followed was not an attack from humanity. It was simply the natural consequence of removing support that had been holding far more together than this body ever understood or acknowledged. I let that statement settle over the room before continuing. We are not here today seeking apology for its own sake, I said. We are here because real people, your people, suffered real consequences because of a decision made in anger and pride. If this body genuinely wishes to repair what was broken, that repair needs to begin with honest acknowledgement, not careful political language designed to avoid responsibility. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, and I felt a sudden wave of uncertainty wash over me, wondering if I had spoken too boldly, too far outside my actual authority within this delegation. But then, slowly, Counselor Vale began to clap, a single, steady sound that gradually spread through scattered sections of the tiers, growing until a noticeable portion of the chamber had joined in, though far from unanimous. The speaker allowed the moment to pass before raising his hand once more, calling the chamber back to order. The council acknowledges the validity of these concerns, he said, his voice carrying a noticeable strain that suggested how difficult those words were for him to say. We formally acknowledge that our decision to dismiss humanity's diplomatic presence was made without adequate understanding of the structural role that presence played within our territories. We further acknowledge that the resulting consequences have caused genuine harm to citizens across multiple systems. It was not a full apology, not in the way I might have hoped, but it was far more than the proud, dismissive silence I had expected when we first arrived. Mira accepted the acknowledgement with a measured nod, neither fully satisfied nor openly dismissive. We appreciate the Council's willingness to acknowledge these facts openly, she said. Humanity is prepared to discuss a renewed framework for cooperation, one built on mutual respect and formal recognition of contribution, rather than the informal, undervalued arrangement that existed previously. However, that framework must be negotiated properly, through structured diplomatic channels, with clear terms that protect both parties from a repeat of this exact situation. Agreed, the speaker said, and though his voice still carried traces of reluctance, there was something underneath it that sounded, for the first time, like genuine understanding, rather than simple political necessity. The formal session continued for several more hours, covering detailed logistics for beginning renewed technical support in the most critically affected systems, alongside broader discussions about establishing a more formal, properly recognized diplomatic relationship moving forward. I listened carefully throughout, occasionally offering input when asked, but mostly simply absorbing the strange, surreal experience of watching a chamber that had once dismissed us so completely, now working diligently to repair what their own decision had broken. By the time the session finally concluded, the broad outline of a new agreement had taken shape, one that included formal recognition of human technical contributions, fair compensation structures, and a guaranteed seat at the table for human representatives during any future decisions affecting matters of mutual interest. It was not a perfect resolution, and I suspected the coming months would involve considerable difficult negotiation over specific details, but it represented something far more substantial than the careless dismissal that had started this entire crisis. As the chamber slowly emptied, Counselor Vale approached me once more, her expression carrying a tired but genuine warmth that had not been present during our earlier exchange. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for speaking honestly today. I suspect it made a difference." "I hope so," I said. "Though I think the real lesson here extends beyond just this one chamber, Counselor." "What do you mean?" I considered my answer carefully before speaking. "I think every species represented in this council, including my own, needs to remember that quiet contribution should never be mistaken for unimportant contribution, I said. Sometimes the people holding everything together are the easiest ones to overlook, precisely because they never demand attention for the work they do. Vale nodded slowly, clearly turning that thought over in her mind. A lesson I doubt this chamber will forget any time soon, she said. Not after everything that unfolded these past 2 weeks. I left the chamber that evening alongside Mira, walking back toward our ship through corridors that felt strangely familiar and entirely different at the same time. The station around us buzzed with a different kind of energy than I remembered from before our departure. Less the comfortable, dismissive confidence of an established power, and more the cautious, humbled atmosphere of an institution still processing exactly how close it had come to genuine disaster. As our ship prepared for departure later that night, I stood once more at the forward viewport, watching the station's lights glittering against the dark curve of the planet below. So much had changed in such a short period of time, and yet I understood that the true work of rebuilding trust between our two peoples was only just beginning. Mira joined me at the viewport, following my gaze toward the station below. "You did well today, Cole," she said. "Better than well, honestly." "I just said what I believed," I said. "I did not expect it to matter as much as it seemed to." "That is exactly why it mattered," she said. "Sometimes the simplest truths carry the most weight, especially when everyone around you has spent too long avoiding them." As our ship finally pulled away from the station, engines humming with that same quiet, steady confidence that had carried us into this entire situation, I thought back to the moment our final transport had left this exact location 2 weeks earlier, the moment I had wondered whether humanity would ever return to this chamber again. We had returned, not as a defeated, dismissed species begging for forgiveness, but as equals, finally recognized for contributions that had been quietly holding a galaxy together for years, without proper acknowledgement. The Council had learned, in the most undeniable way possible, exactly what they had nearly lost through careless pride and casual dismissal. But as I watched the station shrink into the distance behind us, I could not shake one final, lingering thought, a quiet realization that settled over me as the stars outside blurred into long streaks of light once more. The Council had learned their lesson this time. But somewhere out there, scattered across countless other systems and societies humanity had yet to encounter, other powerful institutions existed who had never witnessed what happened when they took our quiet contributions for granted. Other chambers, other leaders, who might one day make the exact same careless mistake, never imagining the consequences that would follow. We had shown the galaxy, in the clearest way possible, exactly what happened when humanity left quietly. The question that remained, lingering in the back of my mind as our ship carried us steadily homeward once more, was simple and unsettling in equal measure. What would happen, somewhere far in the future, if next time we did not choose to come back at all?